They'd spent thousands on their own attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Hernandez who specialized in estate law. Every evening became a strategy session around our dining room table, with legal documents spread out like battle plans, and my parents dissecting every clause, every precedent, every possible angle. "This is about more than money, Alex," my father told me one evening as we sat in his study. "This is about family honor, about doing what's right. Your great aunt trusted me to handle her affairs properly, and I won't let Derek's greed destroy that trust." I believed him completely. My parents had always been pillars of integrity in my life. Dad worked as an electrical engineer for a major firm. Mom taught third grade at the local elementary school. They'd never been wealthy, but they'd given me everything I needed and more. They'd supported my decision to study journalism, helped pay for college, and had been nothing but loving and supportive throughout my entire life. So when they asked me to be present during the court proceedings, I didn't hesitate to agree. "Your family," Mom said, squeezing my hand, "this affects all of us. We want you there to see justice done." The case dragged on for months. Depositions, document reviews, expert testimonies about Aunt Margaret's mental state in her final years. Patricia worked tirelessly, building what seemed like an ironclad case. She'd found witnesses who could testify to Margaret's clear intentions, medical records proving she was of sound mind when she wrote the will, and a paper trail showing Derek's complete absence from family responsibilities. "We've got him," Patricia announced during one of our strategy meetings. "The evidence is overwhelming. No reasonable judge could side with Derek after seeing all this." Uncle Derek, meanwhile, seemed increasingly desperate. His lawyer, a gruff man named Bill Morrison, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, kept filing motions and requesting delays. At one point, Derek himself showed up at our house, the first time I'd seen him in 5 years. He looked older, more weathered than I remembered. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were deep lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But there was something else in his expression when he looked at me, something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the casual indifference I remembered from family gatherings. It was more like recognition, or maybe guilt. "Richard, we need to talk," he said, standing on our front porch like an unwelcome salesman. "This whole legal battle is tearing the family apart. Maybe we can work something out." My father's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to work out, Derek." Margaret made her wishes clear. "You've had 40 years to step up and be a responsible family member. It's too late now." "You don't understand," Derek said, his voice carrying a strange urgency. "There are things about this family that you don't know. Things that could change everything." "The only thing I need to know is that you're trying to steal from the family that actually cared about Margaret," Dad replied coldly. "Now get off my property before I call the police." Derek's eyes found mine one more time, and I saw something that looked almost like an apology. "Alex," he said quietly, "if things get complicated, remember that sometimes the truth isn't what it seems. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who've been protecting you from something terrible." At the time, I thought he was just being cryptic and manipulative, trying to plant seeds of doubt before the trial. My parents certainly saw it that way. "He's getting desperate," Mom said after Derek left. "He knows he's going to lose, so now he's trying to play mind games. Don't let him get to you, sweetheart." The trial date was set for a Tuesday morning in late September. Patricia was confident. My parents were vindicated, and I was just glad the whole ordeal would finally be over. We'd been living with this cloud of legal stress for months, and it had taken a toll on everyone. Dad had been working longer hours, Mom had been more irritable than usual, and family dinners had become tense affairs dominated by legal strategy discussions. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. Something about Derek's visit kept nagging at me, not his cryptic warnings. Those seemed like the desperate ploy of a man facing defeat. But the way he'd looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, like he was carrying some heavy burden that involved me directly. I found myself digging through old family photos, looking for pictures of Derek from when I was younger. There weren't many. He really had been absent from most family events. But in the few photos where he appeared, I noticed something strange. In every single picture where Derek and I were in the same frame, he was looking at me with an intensity that seemed unusual for a distant uncle. Not the casual affection of extended family, but something deeper, something more personal. I shook off the feeling and tried to focus on the trial ahead. Whatever Derek's motivations, the facts were clear. Aunt Margaret had left her estate to my father, Derek had been absent from family responsibilities his entire adult life, and justice would be served. I had no idea that in less than 12 hours, everything I thought I knew about my family, my identity, and my entire life would be turned completely upside down. The Marshals were already preparing their files. The truth was already in motion. And the parents I trusted and loved my entire life were about to become strangers in the most shocking way imaginable. The alarm clock beside my bed ticked toward morning, counting down the final hours of the only life I'd ever known. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning chaos. Lawyers wheeled briefcases down marble hallways, families huddled in nervous clusters outside courtroom doors, and the echo of footsteps created a constant background hum that somehow made everything feel more serious. Patricia Hernandez met us at the security checkpoint, her navy blue suit perfectly pressed and her confidence radiating like a force field. "This is it," she said, shaking hands with my parents. "Judge Morrison has a reputation for cutting through nonsense and sticking to the facts. That's exactly what we want." My father straightened his tie, the good one he usually reserved for job interviews and funerals. "We're ready. 23 years of being the responsible son should count for something." The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that cast everything in a slightly greenish tint. Derek was already seated at the defendant's table with his lawyer, Bill Morrison, whose rumpled appearance hadn't improved since our last encounter. Derek wore a cheap gray suit that looked like it had seen better decades, and when he turned to acknowledge our arrival, I caught that same strange look in his eyes. Part guilt, part sadness, part something I couldn't identify. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Derek's lawyer as Patricia had assured us, took the bench at exactly 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every possible family drama and wasn't impressed by any of it. "This is a straightforward estate dispute," she began, adjusting her reading glasses. The deceased, Margaret Caldwell, left a will dated March 15th of last year, naming Richard Caldwell as primary beneficiary and executor. The contestant, Derek Caldwell, claims this will was executed under undue influence, and that previous documents should take precedence. Patricia stood and launched into her opening statement with surgical precision. She outlined Aunt Margaret's clear mental capacity, the legitimate reasons for favoring Richard, and Derek's decades-long pattern of family abandonment. She presented witness testimonies, medical records, and financial documents that painted Derek as an opportunistic relative who only showed interest in family when money was involved. "Your Honor," Patricia concluded, "the evidence will show that Margaret Caldwell made her final wishes crystal clear. She wanted her estate to go to the family member who had consistently shown responsibility, care, and dedication. That person is Richard Caldwell, not his brother who disappeared for years at a time and only resurfaces when there's potential financial gain." Bill Morrison's opening was less polished, but carried an undertone of desperation that made me uncomfortable. "Your Honor, my client isn't here to grab money that doesn't belong to him. He's here because there are serious irregularities in this case that go far beyond a simple family dispute. Documents were withheld, conversations were misrepresented, and most importantly, Richard Caldwell obtained the deceased's trust through methods that will shock this court." I felt my parents tense beside me. My mother's hand found my father's arm, and I could see her knuckles go white as she gripped his sleeve. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The morning proceeded with testimony from Margaret's neighbors, her doctor, and the lawyer who had drafted her will. Everything seemed to support our case perfectly. Margaret had been of sound mind, she'd expressed clear preferences for Richard, and she'd been suspicious of Derek's motivations on the few occasions when he'd contacted her. But then Bill Morrison called Derek to the stand, and everything began to shift. Derek looked uncomfortable in the witness chair, constantly adjusting his position and avoiding eye contact with our side of the courtroom. Morrison started with basic questions. Derek's relationship with Margaret, his absence from family events, his current financial situation. Standard stuff that wasn't particularly damaging to our case. Then Morrison asked a question that made the entire courtroom go silent. Mr. Caldwell, during your conversations with Margaret in her final months, did she express any concerns about her nephew Alex? Patricia shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? I'll allow it, Judge Morrison said, her eyebrows slightly raised. But get to the point quickly, Counselor. Derek cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand. She was worried about him. She said she'd been having doubts about how Richard came to have custody of Alex in the first place. The words hit me like a physical blow. Custody? What was he talking about? I'd never been in foster care or adoption proceedings. I was Richard and Susan's biological son, born at Denver General Hospital 23 years ago. I had a birth certificate to prove it. My father's face had gone pale, but he was trying to maintain composure. My mother looked like she might be sick. Can you elaborate on what Margaret meant by that statement? Morrison continued. Derek's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said she'd found some documents in her papers from 1999. Old letters, reports from social services. She was starting to piece together what really happened when Alex was born. Objection! Patricia was on her feet again, her voice sharp. This is completely outside the scope of this case. We're here to determine the validity of a will, not to relitigate decades-old family history. Quote, Judge Morrison looked intrigued despite herself. Mr. Morrison, where exactly are you going with this line of questioning? Your Honor, I'm establishing that Margaret Caldwell's decision to exclude my client from her will was based on incomplete information. She believed Richard was the responsible family member who deserved her trust. But in her final months, she discovered information that would have fundamentally changed her opinion of her nephew's character and trustworthiness. The judge allowed the questioning to continue, and Derek's testimony took an increasingly bizarre turn. He talked about Margaret finding old social services documents, about late-night phone calls where she'd expressed doubts about Richard's version of family history, about her plans to hire a private investigator before her death. She told me she'd been carrying guilt for 23 years, Derek said, his voice breaking slightly. She said she should have asked more questions back then, should have been more involved. She was planning to change her will because she realized she'd been wrong about which brother deserved her trust. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. None of this made sense. My parents had never mentioned social services, never suggested there was any mystery about my birth or early childhood. Our family photo albums showed a perfectly normal progression, from newborn to toddler to child, with me growing up in the same house I'd lived in my entire life. But as Derek continued his testimony, I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way my parents exchanged glances whenever he mentioned specific dates. The way my mother's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The way my father's hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. During the lunch recess, I tried to get answers. Dad, what is Derek talking about? What social services documents? What happened when I was born? My father looked older than I'd ever seen him. Son, Derek is desperate. He's making up wild stories to try to confuse the judge and invalidate Margaret's will. Don't let his lies get into your head. But he seemed so specific about dates and documents, and you and Mom looked terrified. We're not terrified, my mother said quickly. We're angry. Angry that Derek would stoop to attacking our family just to get his hands on money that doesn't belong to him. Patricia joined our conversation, looking grim. I have to warn you, this afternoon could get ugly. Morrison is clearly planning some kind of dramatic revelation. Whatever Derek thinks he has, we need to be prepared for anything. When court resumed, Morrison called his final witness, a private investigator named James Chen, who had apparently been hired by Margaret just weeks before her death. Chen took the stand carrying a thick folder that made my stomach drop. Mr. Chen, Morrison began, what did Mrs. Caldwell hire you to investigate? She wanted me to look into the circumstances surrounding her nephew Alex Caldwell's birth and early childhood. Specifically, she wanted to know if there were any irregularities in how Richard and Susan Caldwell came to be his parents. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the sound of my mother quietly crying. And what did your investigation reveal? Chen opened his folder and pulled out several documents. Based on records from Colorado Social Services, hospital documents, and federal databases, I can confirm that Alex Caldwell's legal identity contains significant discrepancies that suggest. That's when the courtroom doors burst open and 3 federal marshals walked in, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "We need to speak with Alex Caldwell immediately," the lead marshal announced, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" "Your Honor, we have a federal warrant related to identity fraud and child abduction dating back 23 years. This case has triggered alerts in our system, and we need to take Alex Caldwell into custody for questioning." The world tilted sideways. Federal marshals, identity fraud, child abduction. The words bounced around in my head like pinballs, refusing to make sense. I looked at my parents, hoping to see confusion that matched my own. Instead, I saw the faces of 2 people whose deepest, darkest secret had just been exposed to a room full of strangers. And in that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change forever. The lead marshal, a tall woman with sharp features and graying temples, stepped forward with the kind of authority that made everyone in the courtroom shrink back slightly. Her badge identified her as Deputy Marshal Sarah Torres, and the way she carried herself suggested she'd done this kind of thing many times before. "Alex Caldwell," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "We need you to come with us for questioning regarding federal charges of identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution." My legs felt like they might give out. "I don't understand. What charges? What prosecution? I've never committed any crimes." Torres exchanged a look with her colleagues before responding. "Sir, we're not arresting you at this time. We believe you may be a victim in this case, but we need to verify your identity and get your statement regarding events that occurred in 1999 and 2000. Judge Morrison had been watching this unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing a particularly dramatic episode of television. "Marshal Torres, while I appreciate the federal government's interest in this matter, I'm in the middle of conducting a civil proceeding. Can this wait until court is adjourned?" "I'm afraid not, Your Honor. This case involves an ongoing federal investigation that has been active for over 2 decades. The testimony we just heard has provided crucial leads that we need to follow immediately." I turned to look at my parents, desperately hoping to see confusion or outrage that would indicate this was all some terrible mistake. Instead, I saw my father's face crumbling like a house of cards, and my mother covering her mouth with both hands as if she could physically hold back the truth from escaping. "Mom?" I said, my voice barely audible. "Dad? What's happening?" My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was my mother who finally broke. "We never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We just wanted to protect you. We just wanted to give you a good life." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't denying it. They weren't protesting their innocence or demanding to see warrants or lawyers. They were admitting to something that I still couldn't fully comprehend. Deputy Marshal Torres moved closer to me, her expression softening slightly. "Alex, I know this is overwhelming, but we need you to come with us so we can explain what we've discovered and help you understand who you really are." "Who I really am?" The phrase came out as a croak. "What does that mean? I'm Alex Caldwell. I was born in Denver in 2001. These are my parents." Torres shook her head gently. "That's not accurate, son. According to our records, Alex Caldwell died in infancy in 1999. Someone has been using his identity for the past 23 years. Someone who we believe was taken from his biological family and given fraudulent documentation." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but even she seemed too stunned to maintain complete control. Patricia Hernandez finally found her voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If federal authorities want to question my clients, they need to follow proper procedures. They can't just storm into a civil proceeding and make wild accusations." "These aren't wild accusations," Torres replied firmly. "We have DNA evidence, medical records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. This investigation began 23 years ago when a 3-year-old boy named Marcus Thompson disappeared from his home in Salt Lake City. The case went cold, but recent advances in database cross-referencing have connected several dots that led us here. Marcus Thompson. The name meant nothing to me, but hearing it spoken aloud triggered something deep in my mind. Not a memory exactly, but a feeling. Like déjà vu, but darker and more unsettling. I don't remember anyone named Marcus, I said, my voice shaking. I don't remember Salt Lake City. I've lived in Denver my entire life. You were very young when you were taken, Torres explained patiently. And there are indications that steps were taken to ensure you wouldn't remember your previous life. False documents were created, a new identity was established, and you were moved far enough away that no one would recognize you. I looked at Derek, who had been sitting silently at the defendant's table throughout this entire exchange. He met my eyes and nodded slowly, as if confirming something I hadn't even asked. You knew, I said to him, when you came to our house, when you kept looking at me strangely during family gatherings, you knew something was wrong. Derek's voice was barely a whisper when he replied, I suspected. You never looked quite right to me, never seemed to fit the timeline Richard gave us, about when Susan got pregnant. But I didn't want to believe my own brother could do something so terrible. I told myself I was imagining things. But Aunt Margaret figured it out, I continued, pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. That's why she was going to change her will. Not because Derek deserved the money, but because she discovered what my parents had done. Quote. Torres nodded. Margaret Caldwell contacted the FBI 6 weeks before her death. She'd found documents hidden in Richard's old belongings that she was storing in her garage. Hospital records, social services reports, even correspondence with people who specialized in creating false identities. She was preparing to turn over everything to federal authorities when she passed away. The implications crashed over me like a tsunami. My entire life was a lie. My birth certificate, my social security number, my school records, my college transcripts. Everything was built on the stolen identity of a baby who had died over 2 decades ago. And the people I'd called mom and dad my entire life had kidnapped a 3-year-old boy and spent 23 years convincing him he was someone else. Where are my real parents? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my head. Torres consulted a folder one of her colleagues handed her. Your biological mother is Elena Thompson. She lives in Provo, Utah, and has never stopped looking for you. Your father, David Thompson, passed away 8 years ago from cancer, but he spent most of his adult life working with missing children organizations, hoping to find you. Elena Thompson, David Thompson, names that should have meant everything to me but felt like words in a foreign language. Somewhere in Utah, a woman had been waiting 23 years for her son to come home, never knowing that he was living a completely different life just a few states away. We need to take you to our field office, Torres continued. We'll need to collect DNA samples for final confirmation, and we'll need your statement about what you remember from your early childhood. But first, we need to formally arrest Richard and Susan Caldwell. The second marshal stepped forward with handcuffs, and reality crashed down like a building collapse. My father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, cheered at my baseball games, and walked me through my first heartbreak, was about to be arrested for kidnapping me. Wait, I said, my voice cracking. Can I talk to them first? Before you arrest them? I need to understand how this happened. Torres hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. But we'll be right here, and anything they say can be used as evidence. I approached the man and woman who had raised me, looking at their faces as if seeing them for the first time. In a way, I was. These weren't my loving parents anymore. These were strangers who had committed an unthinkable crime and somehow convinced themselves it was justified. Why? I asked simply. Why did you take me? Why did you steal someone else's child? My mother, Susan, I had to start thinking of her as Susan, was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. It was my father who answered, his voice hollow and broken. We couldn't have children, he said. We tried for years, went through fertility treatments, suffered through miscarriages. Susan had a breakdown after the 3rd miscarriage. She was hospitalized, and when she got out, she was obsessed with having a baby. He paused, looking at me with eyes full of 23 years of guilt and love and desperation. We were driving through Salt Lake City on vacation when we saw you playing in a park. Your real parents had looked away for just a moment, and Susan said it was a sign from God. She said you were meant to be ours. And you were so young, we thought. We convinced ourselves that you'd forget your old life and be happy with us. The casual way he described destroying an entire family's life was almost more shocking than the crime itself. They had seen a 3-year-old playing in a park and decided to steal him, just like that. No consideration for the parents who would spend decades wondering what happened to their child. No thought about the trauma they were inflicting on a toddler. Just their own desperate desire for a baby, justified by delusion and selfishness. We gave you a good life, Susan managed to say through her tears. We loved you. We gave you everything we could. You gave me a life that wasn't mine, I replied, surprised by the anger I could hear in my own voice. You stole my identity, my family, my entire existence. You made me into a ghost. Deputy Marshal Torres stepped forward. Time's up. Richard and Susan Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, child abduction, identity theft, and fraud. As the handcuffs clicked into place around the wrists of the people who had raised me, I realized that this was just the beginning. Everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong, and somewhere in Utah, a woman named Elena Thompson was about to get a phone call that would change her life forever. The person I had been for 23 years, Alex Caldwell, was about to disappear, and Marcus Thompson, whoever he was about to be reborn. The FBI field office in downtown Denver felt like a different planet. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and the constant hum of computers and printers created an atmosphere that was both sterile and somehow menacing. I sat in a conference room with Deputy Marshal Torres and FBI Special Agent Michael Reeves, staring at a folder full of documents that supposedly told the true story of my life. We know this is overwhelming, Agent Reeves said, his voice gentle but professional. Take your time processing everything. We're going to need to collect some biological samples for DNA confirmation, but that's just a formality at this point. The evidence is pretty conclusive. He opened the folder and spread out several photographs. The first was a missing child poster from 2000, showing a 3-year-old boy with dark hair and bright eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable, even accounting for 20 years of aging. The second photo showed a couple, David and Elena Thompson, standing in what looked like a police station, holding the same missing child poster and looking absolutely devastated. Your biological parents filed a missing person report within hours of your disappearance, Torres explained. David Thompson was a mechanical engineer, Elena was a nurse. They'd taken you to Liberty Park in Salt Lake City for a family picnic. Elena had gone to the restroom. David was setting up the picnic table about 50 yards away. When Elena came back, you were gone. I stared at the photos, trying to feel some spark of recognition, some buried memory that would connect me to these strangers. But there was nothing, just an empty space where 23 years of false memories had built a wall between me and my real past. The investigation consumed their lives, Reeves continued. David quit his job to work full-time on finding you. They hired private investigators, worked with missing children organizations, appeared on talk shows and news programs. Elena never remarried because she said she couldn't move on until she found her son. The weight of that hit me like a physical blow. While I was growing up in suburban Denver, going to soccer practice and birthday parties and school dances, a woman in Utah was spending every day wondering if her child was alive or dead. She'd put her entire life on hold for 23 years, waiting for a phone call that might never come. How did Richard and Susan manage to create a fake identity so convincingly, I asked. This was 2000, not 1950. There were computers, databases, social security records. Reeves pulled out another set of documents. They were smart about it, and they had help. Richard had a college friend named Carl Martinez who worked in vital records for the state of Colorado. Martinez had gambling debts and needed money. For $50,000, he created a complete false identity, using the name and social security number of a baby who had died in Denver in 1999. The methodical nature of it was somehow more disturbing than if it had been a crime of pure impulse. They hadn't just grabbed a child in a moment of desperation. They had planned, bribed officials, and constructed an elaborate deception that lasted over 2 decades. Martinez was arrested this morning, Torres added. He's been living in Arizona under an assumed name, but his involvement in identity fraud cases dates back to the 1990s. Your case was just one of several he facilitated. Agent Reeves opened his laptop and turned it toward me. We'd like you to see something before we go any further. This is a video message from Elena Thompson. We contacted her this morning and asked if she wanted to say anything to you before you decide whether you're ready to meet her. The screen showed a woman in her early 50s sitting in what looked like a living room. She had graying brown hair and eyes that were the same shade as mine. When she spoke, her voice was shaky but determined. Marcus, she began, and hearing that name from her lips sent a chill down my spine. I don't know if you remember me, but I've thought about you every single day for 23 years. I know this must be confusing and frightening, and I don't want to pressure you into anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know that you were loved. You are loved. Your father and I never stopped believing we'd find you someday. She paused, wiping away tears before continuing. David passed away 8 years ago, cancer. But even in his final days, he was still working on finding you. He made me promise to never give up, and I haven't. I still have your bedroom exactly the way it was when you disappeared. I still celebrate your birthday every year. I know you have a whole life now, and I respect that. But if you're willing, I'd like the chance to tell you about who you were before. And maybe we can figure out who you are now. The video ended, leaving the conference room in heavy silence. I felt like I was drowning in emotions I didn't have names for. Grief for a father I'd never really known was dead. Guilt that this woman had suffered for decades because of something I had no control over. Anger at Richard and Susan for stealing not just my identity but my mother's entire adult life. She seems nice, I said finally, which was possibly the most inadequate response in the history of human communication. Torres smiled slightly. She's been incredibly patient throughout this whole process. She knows you need time to adjust to everything you've learned. What happens now? I asked. Legally, I mean. Am I still Alex Caldwell? Do I have to become Marcus Thompson? Are my college transcripts invalid? Is my entire legal existence just going to disappear? Agent Reeves consulted his notes. The legal aspects are complicated, but we've dealt with similar cases before. You'll need to work with federal prosecutors to determine your official legal identity going forward. Most likely, you'll have the option to reclaim your birth name or keep using Alex Caldwell. The courts generally try to minimize disruption to identity fraud victims. And Richard and Susan? They're facing serious federal charges: kidnapping, conspiracy, identity theft, fraud. If convicted, they're looking at 25 to life. Possibly more depending on what other evidence we uncover during the investigation. The people who had raised me, who had loved me in their own twisted way, were going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Part of me felt like I should be devastated by that prospect, but mostly I just felt numb. There's something else you should know, Torres said gently. Elena Thompson isn't your only surviving family. You have a younger sister. My head snapped up. A sister? Jessica Thompson. She was born 2 years after you disappeared. She's 21 now, finishing college at the University of Utah. Elena and David decided to have another child, partly because they hoped it would help them heal, but also because they wanted you to have a sibling to come home to. A sister I'd never met, living a life I should have been part of. The ripple effects of Richard and Susan's crime seemed to expand every time I learned something new. Jessica knows about you, of course. Elena and David never hid the fact that they'd had an older son who was taken. She's been hoping to meet you her whole life. Quote. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd lost. Not just parents, but a father who died still searching for me. A sister who'd grown up knowing she had a brother out there somewhere. An entire alternate life that had been stolen from me when I was too young to even understand what was happening. I'd like to see Elena, I said finally. And Jessica, if she wants to meet me. But I need some time to figure out who I am first. I've been Alex Caldwell for 23 years. I can't just flip a switch and become Marcus Thompson overnight. Torres nodded. Elena suggested that you might want to start with phone calls, maybe video chats. Get to know each other gradually before you decide about meeting in person. She's been waiting 23 years. She's willing to wait as long as you need. Agent Reeves closed the folder. We'll need you to stay in the Denver area for the next few weeks while we wrap up the investigation and prepare for the trial. Is there somewhere you can stay? Friends, other family? The question hit me like a slap. Where could I stay? My apartment was in Alex Caldwell's name, paid for with money earned using a stolen identity. My job, my bank accounts, my entire life was built on a foundation of fraud. And the only family I'd ever known was sitting in federal custody, waiting to be prosecuted for destroying my real family. I'll figure something out, I said, though I had no idea how. As I left the federal building that afternoon, I realized I was walking into a world where I didn't know who I was supposed to be. Alex Caldwell was a fraud, but Marcus Thompson was a stranger. Somewhere between those two identities, I had to figure out how to build a life that was actually mine. The sun was setting over Denver, casting long shadows across the streets I'd walked my entire fake life. Tomorrow, I would have to start the impossible process of learning how to be someone I'd never been allowed to become. But first I had a phone call to make to a woman in Utah who'd been waiting 23 years to hear her son's voice again. I sat in my car outside the federal building for over an hour, staring at the phone number Agent Reeves had given me, Elena Thompson's number. My biological mother's number. The woman who had spent 23 years wondering if her son was alive or dead was just 10 digits away, but I couldn't bring myself to dial. What do you say to someone whose child you supposedly are, but who feels like a complete stranger? How do you apologize for being kidnapped? How do you explain that you don't remember anything about the life that was stolen from you? Finally, as the parking meter expired and darkness settled over the city, I drove to the only place I could think of, my college roommate Jake's apartment. Jake Martinez had been my best friend since freshman year, and if anyone could help me process the surreal nightmare my life had become, it would be him. When he opened the door and saw my face, he immediately knew something catastrophic had happened. Jesus, Alex, you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened in court? Did your parents lose the case? Can I come in? I need to tell you something that's going to sound completely insane. 20 minutes later, Jake was sitting across from me in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head or muttering, "Holy shit," under his breath. I just told him that his best friend of 4 years was actually a kidnapped child whose entire identity was built on fraud. So let me get this straight, he said finally. Your parents, the people who raised you, aren't actually your parents. Your real name is Marcus Thompson. You were kidnapped when you were 3, and the FBI wants you to reconnect with your biological family in Utah. That's the short version, yeah? Jake got up and paced around his living room, running his hands through his hair. This is like something out of a movie. I mean, I always thought your parents were kind of weird. They never wanted to talk about your baby pictures, and your mom got super uncomfortable whenever anyone mentioned genetics or family history. But kidnapping? Identity fraud? That's next-level crazy. It was strange hearing someone else's perspective on Richard and Susan's behavior. I'd never noticed the things Jake was describing. But now that he mentioned them, I could remember dozens of conversations where my parents had deflected questions about my early childhood, or changed the subject when people talked about family resemblances. The worst part is, I still love them, I admitted. I know what they did was horrible, and I'm angry about it, but they're the only parents I've ever known. They took care of me when I was sick, helped me with homework, came to every baseball game. How do you reconcile that with the fact that they destroyed another family to get me? Quote. Jake sat back down and looked at me seriously. You don't have to reconcile it right now. This just happened today. Give yourself permission to have complicated feelings about complicated people. That evening, Jake helped me gather some clothes and personal items from my apartment. Everything felt surreal, like I was packing up someone else's life. Every photo, every document, every memento was connected to an identity that had been stolen from a dead infant. Even my college diploma, hanging on the wall in a cheap frame, felt like evidence of a crime. You can stay here as long as you need, Jake said as we loaded boxes into his car. My couch is pretty comfortable, and I've got that extra key anyway. Back at Jake's place, I finally worked up the courage to call Elena Thompson. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, and I had to hang up twice before I managed to let it ring. Hello? Her voice was cautious, like she wasn't sure who might be calling at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Is this Elena Thompson? Yes, this is Elena. This is Alex. I mean Marcus. The FBI said you wanted to talk to me. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sound that might have been crying or laughing or both. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, it's really you, your voice. You sound so much like your father did at that age." "I'm sorry I don't remember you," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I wish I did. I'm sorry you've been waiting all these years. I'm sorry about everything." "Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened was your fault. You were just a baby." The word sweetheart hit me like a physical force. It was such a maternal thing to say, so natural and warm, and it made me realize how desperately I wanted to have a real mother. Not someone who had stolen me, but someone who had actually chosen to bring me into the world. "Can you tell me about him?" I asked. "About David, my father?" Elena's voice brightened, and for the next hour, she painted a picture of a man I'd never known but somehow felt connected to. David Thompson had been funny and kind, obsessed with building model airplanes and teaching kids about science. He'd coached Little League for 10 years, even after I disappeared, because he said it made him feel closer to me. He used to say that wherever you were, he hoped someone was teaching you to throw a curveball, Elena said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. He was convinced that when we found you, the first thing you'd want to do was play catch. I thought about all the times Richard had played catch with me in our backyard, teaching me the mechanics of pitching, helping me practice for school teams. It was one of my favorite memories of growing up, and now it felt tainted by the knowledge that my real father had been somewhere else, dreaming about doing the same thing. "What was I like?" I asked. Before I was taken?" "You were fearless," Elena said immediately. "Always climbing things you shouldn't climb, always asking questions about everything. You had this laugh that could fill up a whole room. And you were obsessed with dinosaurs. You knew the names of every single species, and you carried around this little plastic triceratops everywhere you went." She paused, and I could hear her voice getting emotional again. "You used to call me Mama and David Daddy-O. I don't know where you got that from, but you thought it was hilarious. Every morning, you'd run into our bedroom and jump on the bed and shout, 'Good morning, Mama and Daddy-O,' at the top of your lungs." These details should have triggered memories, but they felt like stories about someone else's child. The 3-year-old Elena was describing seemed like a completely different person from the Alex Caldwell who had grown up in Denver. "I'd like to meet Jessica," I said finally. "My sister, if she wants to meet me." "She's been waiting by the phone all day," Elena laughed. "She's at school right now, but she'll be home tomorrow evening. Maybe we could do a video call? All 3 of us together?" After we hung up, I sat on Jake's couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything I'd learned. I had a sister who'd grown up knowing about me, a father who'd died still searching for me, a mother who'd put her life on hold for over 2 decades, waiting for a phone call like the one we just had. But I also had 23 years of memories with Richard and Susan Caldwell. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings and bedtime stories and scraped knees and homework help and driving lessons. Those experiences were real, even if they were built on a foundation of lies. Jake emerged from his bedroom with a beer and a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "You know how you always said you felt like you didn't quite fit in your family? Like you were fundamentally different from your parents in ways you couldn't explain?" I nodded. It was something I'd mentioned casually over the years. How I was more outgoing than Richard and Susan. How I loved taking risks while they were cautious about everything. How I'd always felt like I was performing the role of their son rather than naturally being their son. "Maybe that's because you weren't their son," Jake continued. "Maybe some part of you always knew something was wrong, even if you couldn't put your finger on what it was." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself trying to remember being 3 years old, trying to excavate some buried memory of Elena and David Thompson and a life in Salt Lake City. But there was nothing there except a strange, hollow feeling where my earliest memories should have been. Tomorrow, I would talk to Jessica Thompson for the first time. I would start the slow, complicated process of building relationships with people who were genetically my family but felt like strangers. And eventually, I would have to decide who I wanted to be going forward. Alex Caldwell, the kidnapped child living a stolen life, or Marcus Thompson, a man trying to reclaim an identity that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what he was losing. The only thing I knew for certain was that nothing would ever be simple again. 6 months later, I stood in the Salt Lake City airport, holding a sign that said, "Welcome home, Marcus," that Jessica had insisted on making. It was decorated with dinosaur stickers. Apparently, my obsession with prehistoric creatures had become family legend. Elena and Jessica were driving from Provo to pick me up, and this would be the first time I'd seen either of them in person. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and awkward video calls, as three strangers tried to figure out how to become a family. Richard and Susan Caldwell had pled guilty to all charges in exchange for 25 years instead of life in prison. I'd testified at their sentencing hearing, though I still wasn't sure if what I felt for them was love, hate, or something more complicated than either. The federal case had made national news. "Kidnapped toddler found after 23 years" was the headline that followed me everywhere. I'd done one carefully controlled interview with CNN to tell my side of the story, partly because Agent Reeves said it might help other missing children cases, and partly because I wanted people to understand that identity theft wasn't just about stolen credit cards. It could steal entire lives. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma specialist the FBI had connected me with, had helped me understand that my struggle with identity wasn't unusual for someone in my situation. "You're not losing yourself," she'd explained during one of our sessions. "You're discovering who you always were underneath the false identity that was imposed on you." But theory was one thing. Standing in an airport about to meet my biological family was something else entirely. I spotted them before they saw me. Elena's graying brown hair was exactly like in the photos, and Jessica looked like a younger version of her mother with my dark eyes. They were both scanning the crowd nervously, holding matching Marcus signs that made me smile despite my anxiety. When Elena saw me, her face crumpled with 23 years of relief and joy and grief all hitting her at once. She didn't run toward me like they do in movies. She walked carefully, as if she was afraid I might disappear again if she moved too quickly. "Marcus," she said when she reached me, and hearing that name from her lips in person felt different than it had over the phone, more real. More like it actually belonged to me. "Hi, Mom," I said, testing the word. It felt strange, but not wrong. Jessica hung back for a moment, suddenly shy after months of enthusiastic video calls. She was studying marine biology at the University of Utah and had spent our conversations telling me about sea turtles and coral reefs, with the same intensity Elena said I'd once brought to discussing dinosaurs. "I brought you something," she said finally, pulling a small wrapped package from her backpack. Inside was a plastic triceratops, obviously old and well-loved. "It was yours," Elena explained, her voice thick with emotion. "I kept it in your room all these years. Jessica used to play with it sometimes when she was little, but she always put it back exactly where it belonged." Holding that little dinosaur triggered something deeper than memory, a feeling, a sense of familiarity that went beyond rational thought. It smelled like childhood, like home, like something I'd lost, without knowing I was looking for it. The drive to Provo was easier than I'd expected. Jessica peppered me with questions about Denver, college, what it was like discovering the truth. Elena was quieter, stealing glances at me in the rearview mirror, like she was still convincing herself I was real. Their house, my childhood home, was a modest 2-story building with a garden in the front yard and a basketball hoop in the driveway. Elena led me upstairs to a room that had obviously been frozen in time. Dinosaur posters on the walls, a toddler-sized bed with a blue comforter, toys arranged on shelves like museum displays. "I know it's strange," Elena said softly. "David always said I should redecorate, make it into an office or something practical, but I couldn't. I kept thinking that when you came home, you'd want to see how we remembered you." I sat on the tiny bed and picked up a book that was lying open on the nightstand, The Land Before Time by Patricia Lauber. The pages were worn soft from repeated readings, and when I opened it, I found David Thompson's handwriting in the margins. Little notes like, "Marcus loves this part," and ask about the difference between herbivores and carnivores. "He read to you every night," Elena said. "Even after you were gone, he'd come in here sometimes and read aloud, said he was practicing for when you came back." That evening, we sat around their kitchen table eating Elena's homemade lasagna and looking through photo albums. There were pictures of me as a baby, as a toddler, and then a 23-year gap before Jessica appeared. But Elena had filled that gap with photos from missing children events, newspaper clippings about the case, and pictures of the family we might have been. Birthday cakes for children who weren't there. Christmas mornings with empty spaces under the tree. "I need to ask you something," I said during dessert. "Do you want me to legally change my name back to Marcus Thompson? Because I've been thinking about it, and I'm not sure what feels right." Elena and Jessica exchanged a look before Elena answered. "Sweetheart, you've been Alex Caldwell for 23 years. That's who you became, who you grew into. Marcus was a 3-year-old who loved dinosaurs and called his parents silly names. You're both of those people now, and neither of us wants you to throw away the person you've become just to make us feel better." "What if I used both?" I suggested. "Marcus Alexander Thompson? That way I'm not losing Alex completely, but I'm reclaiming Marcus too." Jessica grinned. "Marcus Alexander Thompson. I like it. It sounds like someone who studies dinosaurs and marine biology and becomes a famous scientist." Later that night, I walked around the neighborhood where I'd spent the first 3 years of my life. Nothing looked familiar, but everything felt somehow right. The way the mountains looked against the sky, the smell of the air, the sound of the wind through the trees. Maybe genetic memory was real, or maybe I was just desperate to feel connected to something authentic. I found myself at Liberty Park, the place where my life had changed forever. It looked like any other city park. Playground equipment, picnic tables, walking paths. But somewhere in this ordinary place, a family had been destroyed and rebuilt in the most twisted way imaginable. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How's it going? Are you remembering anything?" I typed back, "No memories yet, but it feels like home anyway." 3 days later, I flew back to Denver to pack up my life there. I decided to transfer to the University of Utah for my senior year and change my major to journalism with a focus on missing persons cases. If my experience could help other families find their missing children, then maybe something good could come from 23 years of lies. Jake helped me load everything into a U-Haul, and we drove it to Utah together. He'd decided to transfer too. "Someone needs to make sure you don't get too serious about saving the world," he said. Elena, Jessica, and I spent the summer building the kind of relationships that should have developed over 2 decades. We went camping in the mountains where David used to take me as a toddler. We visited his grave and I told him about the curveball Richard had taught me to throw. Jessica taught me to snorkel in Utah Lake, and I helped her study for her marine biology exams. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments when none of us knew what to say, times when grief for our lost years overwhelmed the joy of being reunited. But slowly, carefully, we started becoming the family we were always meant to be. Richard and Susan Caldwell wrote me letters from prison. I read them but never responded. Dr. Chen said I might feel ready to engage with them someday, or I might not, and either choice was valid. For now, I was focused on building a future, rather than dissecting the past. Uncle Derek surprisingly became one of my strongest supporters during the transition. He'd known something was wrong for decades, but had chosen family loyalty over truth. Now he was trying to make amends by helping with legal expenses and being the uncle he should have been all along. A year after that first phone call with Elena, I legally changed my name to Marcus Alexander Thompson and graduated from the University of Utah with a degree in journalism. My senior thesis was about the long-term psychological effects of parental kidnapping, and it won the university's award for undergraduate research. Elena and Jessica were in the front row at graduation, holding a sign that said, "Congratulations, Marcus Alexander," with dinosaur stickers around the border. In the audience was also a representative from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who offered me a job working on cold cases. Today, I work as an investigative journalist, specializing in missing persons. I've helped reunite 4 families with their missing children, and I've written articles that have generated new leads in dozens of cold cases. Every time I help a family find their missing child, I think about David Thompson and how proud he would be that his son found a way to turn tragedy into purpose. I still don't remember being 3-year-old Marcus Thompson, but I've learned that identity isn't just about memories. It's about choices, connections, and the family you build around yourself. The parents who kidnapped me gave me 23 years of lies, but they couldn't steal who I was meant to become. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Decide who we want to be and build a life around that choice. My name is Marcus Alexander Thompson. I was kidnapped when I was 3, lived a stolen life for 23 years, and found my way home. This is my story, and I'm finally ready to own it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.